The late 1960s were a period of cultural revolution and societal change, but for many young people, it was also a time of profound uncertainty. Teenage girls, in particular, found themselves navigating a landscape that encouraged independence and self-discovery, but often without the necessary support or safeguards. The rise of free love, communal living, and drug culture offered a promise of liberation, but for many teens, it masked environments rife with exploitation. These young people, already vulnerable due to fractured family structures and a lack of guidance, were often thrust into situations far beyond their years. This video explores the lives of the three youngest members of the Manson family: Ruth Ann Moorehouse, Dianne Lake, and Sherry Cooper. Barely out of childhood, these girls were drawn into the orbit of Charles Manson, a man who understood the vulnerabilities of adolescence all too well. Manson's manipulative tactics, combined with the allure of belonging and rebellion, proved devastatingly effective. He exploited their innocence, encouraging them to take on adult roles without the maturity or experience to fully understand the consequences. For teenage girls like Ruth Ann, Dianne, and Sherry, the cultural moment seemed to validate their desire to be treated as adults. They wanted freedom, independence, and to be seen as equals in a world that often infantilized young women. Yet in pursuing this, they found themselves subjected to dangers that society was ill-prepared to protect them from. Manson, a seasoned manipulator, capitalized on this cultural naivete. By positioning himself as a protector, spiritual leader, and romantic partner, he created a system of emotional and sexual control that left these girls vulnerable and deeply entangled in his web. In telling their stories, this video isn't meant to sensationalize their experiences, but to examine the cultural and societal factors that allowed such tragedies to unfold. The late 1960s may have been a time of progress and liberation, but for many teen girls, it was also a dangerous time to grow up. The lessons from their lives remain a sobering reminder of the perils of treating teens as adults too soon, particularly in environments where exploitation is disguised as freedom. In the summer of 1969, 16-year-old Sherry Cooper, a local girl, started working at Spawn Ranch as a caretaker for the horses. On July 22nd, the Manson family initiated Cooper, who they called Simi Valley Sherry, with a group orgy that verged on rape. According to later testimony by Linda Kasabian, she saw Manson try to perform intercourse with the girl, who bit him. Charlie slapped her in the face, knocked her down, and engaged in an undetermined sexual act. He then told the male and female members of the family to engage in sexual acts with Sherry. They each took off their clothes and followed his orders. Hours before the Spawn Ranch raid on August 16th, just after the murders, Simi Valley Sherry tried to escape, but was caught by the family. Just a few hours later, police descended on Spawn Ranch. This was part of their auto theft investigation, which had gone on for several months. During the raid, Sherry gave the alias of Ruth Ann Moorehouse, which was in fact the married name of another teen girl, Ruth Ann Moorehouse, also known as Awish. 10 days later, members of the family killed a ranch hand, and on September 1st, they fled to Death Valley. Things in Death Valley were very tense, as news of Shorty's murder and hints of other killings began to spread through the group. Around September 15th, Charlie tried to force Simi Valley Sherry to perform oral sex on Juan Flynn, another Spawn Ranch hand who went to Death Valley hoping to learn what happened to his friend Shorty Shea, killed on August 26th. Sherry refused Charlie's order, and he beat her. He then forced Barbara Hoyt to do what Sherry refused, and in fear for her safety, Hoyt complied. That night, Sherry and Barbara started talking. Barbara whispered that she overheard Sadie, Susan Atkins, talking about stabbing someone. In panic, the teens decided to run away. They didn't sneak out covertly into the night. At dawn on the 16th, they simply announced their intentions to leave and walked away. When Charlie discovered Sherry and Barbara missing, he tore into whoever was on sentry and then drove into Ballarat. He found the girls eating breakfast in the local general store. He stood outside using some kind of witchy hand signals. The girls went out and flatly told him they weren't coming back. Charlie simmered down, gave them some cash, and wished them well. The girls got a lift to Trona by the owner of the store, where they bought some shoes and purchased bus tickets back to LA. Charlie's clemency, of course, was a facade. Once back at Barker Ranch, he ordered Clem and Bruce to drive to Los Angeles, find Barbara and Sherry, and kill them both. While Clem and Bruce were in LA searching for Sherry Cooper and Barbara Hoyt, Juan Flynn defected the family. He ran to a neighbor's where other former family members were living in a prospector's cabin. Charlie was upset that Clem failed to find the two missing girls. Leaving Tex Watson in charge, armed with a shotgun, Manson drove to Los Angeles to try to locate Sherry and Barbara. He also had no luck. Barbara had found her way back to her folks. Initially, nobody was certain where Sherry had gone, and some actually believed that she was one of the many other rumored victims of the Manson gang. But she simply went underground. Turns out, she was living with Danny DiCarlo, a member of the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club, in Venice Beach that fall of '69. We hear nothing more of Sherry until 1975, when a television interview filmed in Canada is released. Danny DiCarlo and Sherry, now married to DiCarlo, were interviewed by this journalist. Danny had a young son at the time he was living with the family at Spahn Ranch. Dennis would then have been around 7 at the time of his interview. The couple also had a daughter, Gina, born in 1972. After talking to police in November 1969 and helping to implicate the family and Manson in the murders, DiCarlo took off after testifying during the following year's trials. He failed to receive what might have been his percentage of the reward money raised by friends of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. Guess that meant he was hard up for cash.
Danny and Sherry came to Canada and spent 4 years stealing credit cards, ripping off cars, and breaking into safes.
I had a lot of fun up there.
Yeah.
We just got back. We used to be in Sherry's up there for almost 4 years.
He made so much money we didn't know what to do with it. We partied, we ate pheasant under glass. We were living pretty high on the hog. We were doing really good. I mean, if we were smart, we would have taken his crooked earnings or whatever, and we would have invested it, but we didn't. We just partied.
Spent a lot of money.
How many housefulls of furniture did you leave behind you moving around?
Left lots.
How many sets of dishes?
Jesus Christ.
Danny, Sherry, and the children later moved to Oregon. DiCarlo, we believe, owned a gas and service station there. Eventually, the couple divorced, and Sherry returned to the Los Angeles area with their daughter. Sadly, Gina died in 1991 in a car accident in Arizona. Sherry is believed to be living in Southern California today. In late 1967, Charlie, Mary, Lynette, Patricia, and Susan were road tripping around the American Southwest. During their travels that December, the group visited Hog Farm, the most famous commune of its time. Founded by Wadey Gravy, true name Hugh Romney, a peace activist from New York. During their brief stay, the women met the Lake family. Mrs. Lake made a point of telling the women about her daughter Dianne, who was in the Los Angeles area with friends. She even gave Charlie a photo of her daughter, an auburn-haired 13-year-old, and asked him to keep an eye out for her. At the start of '68, Charlie and the women were ensconced in Topanga Beach, living in a house known as the Spiral Staircase, a flood-damaged Dutch colonial revival. The Spiral Staircase was a local hangout, possibly a drug den. That winter, at a party at the Spiral Staircase, Lynn looked into a room full of people and spied a familiar face. "It's Dianne," she shouted. Charlie and the women greeted Dianne Lake, daughter of the couple from the Hog Farm. Dianne, as she admitted in her recent memoir, had been molested as a child and was very developed physically, often attracting the attention of older men. In fact, she got booted from the hog farm for having sex with adults, which might have put Wavy Gravy into legal jeopardy. Diane's parents agreed to let her work for a Los Angeles couple as an au pair. Now 14 years old and living with another couple in a polyamorous situation, she'd been in and out of communes and group sex situations for a year. Her parents had signed a letter effectively emancipating the teen should she ever be questioned by police. In Diane's 2017 memoir, she described her first meeting with Manson. Charlie stood up and looked into my eyes so deeply and intimately that I almost turned away on instinct. Instead, I held his gaze and felt like he was looking into me. "So this is our Diane," he said, and pulled me to his chest in a hug so close I could feel his heartbeat. He held on for several seconds. Tears welled up into my eyes as I took in his embrace. Charlie held me at arm's length, looked at me and said, "Oh, you're beautiful. I want to talk to you. I've been looking for you." The women noted how juvenile Diane was, not just in age, but demeanor. She'd become a plaything for adults with tastes bordering on perversion, lost and voiceless in a world of debauchery. Diane also remembered the first time she faced Charlie's temper. We were in the kitchen preparing some food when Charlie walked in. He was clearly distressed. He took some ice out of an ice tray in the Frigidaire, put it in a dish towel, and held it to his mouth. His eyes looked different. I tried to get his attention because he didn't seem in a very good mood. I hated seeing him unhappy, and my instinct was to distract him from whatever was bothering him. "Charlie, where are we going from here?" I asked. "Don't ask questions," he snapped. "Can I help you with anything?" I asked. "Do you want some food?" Before I knew what was happening, he dropped the ice pack into the sink and whacked me across the face. I slipped back and landed on the floor. "Do I look like I want any food?" he spat. Charlie said, "You needed me to do that, little one. You have never had any man teach you when to speak or when to be quiet. The man is the head of the household, and you have never had a man or a father. You will learn to be a woman." He kissed me on the forehead. That February, Susan Atkins, a.k.a. Sadie Mae Glutz, took off with a man named John Hall, a.k.a. Bruce Bluestein, who also agreed to pretend to be married to Diane if the police hassled them. In April 1968, after the birth of Mary and Charlie's son, an 18-year-old man came knocking on the door of what had been a friend's house. The family was now staying there. Diane answered the door, inviting Paul Watkins in to what had been an orgy. Paul didn't stick around that day, but that summer when he visited the family at Spahn Ranch, Charlie told Diane to make sure Paul stayed. The two of them spent a lot of time together. Yet later, Manson grew angered at what Watkins referred to as little alliances and tried to break these connections up. Diane was one of many teens and young women who were heavily trafficked during this era. Once, in exchange for sleeping on a friend's couch, she was obligated to sleep with the man in thanks. She was displeased and cried, but submitted, knowing Charlie would be pissed if she didn't. One day, Diane remarked to Mary Bruner that she wished she could be a snake slithering through the grass, the reptile's method of cooling itself from the heat of the sun. That's how she got the nickname Snake. In the summer of 1968, the family discovered Spahn Ranch in Chatsworth and moved there. This after staying briefly at the home of Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. By that summer, Snake was emotionally regressing. Lynn Frome wrote of the youngest member of the family, "She was more of a child than she had been when we met her," and described encountering the 14-year-old compliantly being groped by an older hippie visiting Spahn Ranch. Even Diane's mom, during a visit to the ranch that season, referred to her own daughter as a dope. After the family went to Death Valley in autumn of '68, and then most returned to Los Angeles weeks later, Dianne was supposed to stay in the desert. Instead, she left with Bobby Beausoleil. Angry, Charlie sent Dianne to their friend Gary Hinman's. Gary exuded none of the tension I had been feeling from Charlie and the family. He showed me his prayer beads and explained about his Buddhist faith. He was planning a trip to Japan sometime the following summer. He recited the Buddhist vow of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo to me, which means to embrace one's Buddha nature to end suffering. Dianne claimed in her recent tell-all that she had sex with Gary during her stay, yet again thanking her host through sex. After a few days, Gary offered to take her somewhere, knowing he would incite Manson's wrath if he returned her to him. Instead, he drove her to Spawn Ranch, where she stayed with the hippies in the back house until Charlie agreed to take her back. By the spring of '69, Dianne was clearly having some kind of mental health crisis. One of the girls found her sitting beside George, saying something like, "Walt Disney died for us." Afterward, Squeaky wrote, "George told me there's something wrong with that girl." Dianne claimed in her recent book that she had also been sexually assaulted by Manson that season. Charlie and several women drove to Hog Farm looking for Mr. and Mrs. Lake. A few weeks later, Mr. Lake came to Spawn Ranch, informing Dianne that he and her mother had separated. From there, the teen went downhill. There were times that she had to be brought to the shower to be bathed. In July of '69, their friend Gary Hinman was killed by members of the family. 2 weeks later, the Tate and LaBianca murders were committed. In the morning of August 10th, Dianne encountered Leslie Van Houten after the murders of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. I heard Leslie come in probably around 7. She asked me to help her get some firewood, which we used to build a fire. She took a rope off her bed that was with the pile of stuff and put it in the flames. She also added a brown purse and some credit cards. We both turned and saw some headlights headed our way. Leslie begged me to help her out and pulled the rope out of the flames, ran into the bathroom, and tried to put it out. "Snake, don't let that man see me," she said. "He just gave me a ride from Griffith Park." Then she jumped into her bed, pulling the sheet over her entire body and face. 3 men pulled up to the front of the house, but only one of them approached. He pushed his way partially through the door and asked about Leslie. I told him she wasn't in, and he insisted that he had just dropped her off. I tried not to look rattled, so I just stared him down. In only a few minutes, he got into his car and left. Leslie must have been holding her breath, because there was no sign of movement until she decided it was safe enough to remove the sheet. She handed me some wood to build up the fire again. She finished burning the little brown purse, even though it was difficult. It didn't catch very easily. The credit cards burned, and then she took off the clothing she was wearing and burned that too. I watched the flames consume everything while she took a shower. When she got out of the shower, she showed me a plastic bag of coins and dumped them on the table. We both counted about $8 without counting the Canadian coins. I had no idea that this was all taken from the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. That week after the murders, Manson was particularly stressed about the stolen goods on the property as well as the underage kids. He arranged for 2 of them, including Dianne, to join Tex Watson out in Death Valley. When I got word of our departure, my assumption was that Charlie was planning for us to escape to the desert because Helter Skelter was on the horizon. On August 16th, during the Spawn Ranch auto theft raid, Dianne and Tex were still in Olanche. On August 18th, the day the family was released following the raid, Tex confessed to Dianne about the murders. She was horrified, but stuck there. Weeks later, after the family killed another man, the family was in Death Valley, and Charlie was a madman, beating Snake, Kitty Ludesinger, Stephanie Schramm, and news was beginning to spread among the group of the killings. In September, several members of the family committed arson of an earth mover, which soon resulted in another raid by law enforcement. The family were arrested and sent to the jail in Independence, but Susan Atkins was transported to Los Angeles for questioning regarding the Gary Hinman murder. On October 23rd, Manson, Catherine Scher, Dianne, and Ruth Ann Moorehouse were held to answer on the arson charge. Another man, John Haught, had allegedly also participated in the burning, but was released. He died 2 weeks later under suspicious circumstances. During the grand jury, Dianne was called to testify. Weeks later, she was admitted to Patton State Hospital, diagnosed as schizophrenic. Lake was also battling anorexia at the time, and a powerful confrontation with another eating disorder patient helped her overcome the addiction to starve herself. In early June 1970, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi visited Dianne Lake at Patton Hospital. After a voluntary commitment at the psychiatric hospital, she'd recovered enough to testify. Her own parents were still of little support. In the handwritten Patton State Hospital nursing notes, the attendant jotted that Lake wants very much to go straight, stated that she had been fucked to death, and that she was afraid of the Manson family doing away with her. Wishes she had some place to go to where she could live another way. Dianne got that second chance at life. In August 1970, she was released from Patton State and remanded into the custody of her new guardian, Jack Gardner, the officer who had arrested her the autumn before. Dianne was a willing witness for the prosecution against Manson, Susan Atkins, Pat Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. She also was adopted by the Gardner family, who enrolled her in her senior year of high school in Independence, providing a support system she never had from her own folks. Dianne never again lived with her biological family. She married a few years later, although it ended in divorce. In the mid-1970s, she married again, had children, and moved to the Pacific Northwest. There, she worked many years in banking and then as an educator. After her husband's death, she co-wrote a book, Member of the Family, My Story of Charles Manson, Life Inside His Cult, and the Darkness That Ended the 60s, published October 2017 by William Morrow. In support of her memoir, Lake was a guest on several talk shows to discuss this time in her life and the crimes associated with the family. She acknowledged that for many years, her own children didn't know her history with the infamous Manson cult. In time, she learned to let go of the shame attached to her memories and to forgive herself for being swept up in a movement she had no control over. Dianne is now retired and a grandmother. On one hitchhiking trip, his first summer of freedom in '67, Charlie Manson was picked up by ex-pastor Dianne Moorehouse, who invited him home for dinner. At the Moorehouse home in San Jose, California, Charlie ate dinner, read the Bible, and sang spirituals with Dianne. He also found 2 objects to admire: a piano that Dianne said he could have, and Dianne's 14-year-old daughter. Ruth Ann Moorehouse, a pretty brunette, was the youngest child of Dianne and his wife Audrey. She was born in Toronto, Canada. Dianne later proved himself a creepy old man, and some have suspected that Ruth might have been molested by her father. She was certainly highly sexualized for someone so young. A week later, Manson returned and bartered Dianne's piano for a 1961 Volkswagen microbus. Wheels meant more freedom to Manson than any old piano ever could. Manson soon brought Mary Bruner and Lynette Frome, who he was living with in the San Francisco area, to stay at the Moorehouse residence. Though they intended a brief visit, 2 weeks passed with no plans to leave. Dianne, captivated by Manson's spiritual musings, stayed up late talking, while his wife Audrey grew increasingly frustrated. She eventually left to stay with her sister, leaving Dianne with Manson, Mary, Lynn, and Ruth Ann. One day, Charlie and Ruth Ann took off together in the VW bus. Her mother called the house several times, demanding to know where her daughter was. When she spoke to Lynette, Audrey was told not to worry. Meanwhile, in Mendocino County, Charlie had sex with the 14-year-old a few times before being found by police who'd been contacted by Ruth Ann's mother. Manson was arrested. Ruth Ann was sent home, but not before Charlie gave her a piece of advice. Marry some poor schmuck, and you'll be emancipated. Then you can leave him and do whatever you want to do. Not long after, Dean and Audrey got divorced. Manson and the women moved on, settling briefly in Santa Barbara. During more of their journeys that season, they stopped again in San Jose at the Moorehouse home. Dean immediately ran outside, shouting about Charlie deflowering his precious daughter. Manson and the women got back in the bus and quickly drove away. But Mary and Lynn spoke to Ruth Ann briefly before departing and told her where they'd be staying in Santa Barbara. Meanwhile, Moorehouse grabbed a shotgun and set off in pursuit. He had no trouble tracking the black bus, and somewhere along the road, he cornered Charlie, announced that he was going to kill him, and put the shotgun to his head. The others from the bus were frozen with fear. This crazy man was about to murder him, and Charlie wasn't afraid. Moorehouse screamed that Charlie was about to die, and Charlie smiled and said quietly, "Go ahead, shoot me," which stopped Moorehouse cold. Charlie's tone was calm and his voice didn't quaver. He gently put his hand on Moorehouse's shoulder and talked about how love was so much better than anger, and what a relief it was when you gave up your individuality and became part of a real family. Moorehouse put down the gun. 3 days later, Ruth Ann ran away. Dean tracked her down where Manson and the women were staying and dragged his daughter home. But not before Charlie slipped Dean a tab of acid. Old Dean was noticeably calmer when he departed than when he arrived. Over the months to come, he would grow even weirder than before. Manson, however, didn't want to get arrested again, so he convinced Ruth Ann to go home, but reminded her that if she were married, she'd be free. She went back to San Jose and married a 23-year-old bus driver named Edward Wabelhorst. She bided her time for a few months until she could join Charlie and the women. By late spring of '68, in the Los Angeles area now, Charlie and the women were living with Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. Through Wilson, they met talent scout Greg Jacobson and record producer Terry Melcher. That's when Ruth Ann returned. She ditched the husband she swindled into marrying a few months before. When Ruth arrived, Manson whisked her into Dennis's bedroom for sex. The teen was turned off when Charlie also invited Lynette to join them, but she didn't say no. Over the next few months, the dark-haired adolescent found herself the object of many men's attentions and was often used as Charlie's pawn. He would lure a man with the promise of sex with lovely Ruth Ann, getting them to agree to him, or he'd withhold Ruth Ann until he got what he wanted from one of her many admirers. One of those admirers was Terry Melcher, who tried to hire the teen as his live-in housekeeper just to have her close. Meanwhile, crazy Dean Moorehouse showed up at Wilson's. The acid trip Charlie sent the ex-preacher on the previous fall had caused a dramatic personality change in the man. He wasn't preaching the Bible anymore, and no longer looked the part of the devout minister. He'd grown his balding hair out and wore an untidy beard. Moorehouse became a fixture at the house, a weird gnome with his gut hanging out, ogling the hot Sunset Strip babes that liked to visit the famous drummer who lived there. When the family later relocated to Spahn Ranch, Ruth Ann was especially helpful at housekeeping. Sandra Good remembered, Ruth went after the kitchen cupboards with gusto. She removed every greasy glass jelly jar, restaurant coffee mug, and chipped teacup, and washed them out in a big pot of sudsy boiled water. She tore out old shelf liners, put in new, and then proudly put back her sparkling assortment of glasses, pottery, and china. It was in the summer of '68, living at Spahn Ranch, that many family members got nicknames, not given by Charlie in most cases, but by old George Spahn, the owner. Ruth Ann became "Owish." One source cited that it was the whistling sound men made when the pubescent beauty walked by. Owish was in charge of garbage runs. She was so young that anyone would take pity on her if she were caught. In early '69, after the family left Spawns for Death Valley and came back again, Owish got arrested, possibly on shoplifting charges, and placed in juvenile hall. Old George Spawn agreed to act as her foster parent to get her out. When the Straight Satans came around, Owish was a favorite, particularly of Danny DeCarlo's. In the fall of '69, after the murders, when the family fled back to Death Valley, Ruth Ann was allegedly one who helped commit the arson of the freeloader, which led to a raid at Barker and Myers ranches and the eventual capture of the family for murder. A week after the raid, on October 15th, 15 arson suspects were arraigned in Inyo Superior Court, with bail set at $236,500. 10 of those arrested were then freed, charges dropped, including Pat Krenwinkel. The remaining were Charles Manson, Catherine Scher, Ruth Ann Moorehouse, John Philip Haught, and Dianne Lake. On October 23rd, Manson, Gypsy, Snake, and Owish were held to answer on the arson charge. John Philip Haught, aka Zero, was released a few days before as investigators found insufficient evidence to hold him. Sadly, his freedom was very brief. 6 weeks later, the Manson family were formally arrested on charges relating to the Tate and LaBianca murders of the summer before. Leslie, Steve Grogan, Gypsy, Owish, Brenda, and Snake were transported to Los Angeles, subpoenaed for the coming grand jury. Owish, Brenda, and Snake did testify, and needless to say, those three gave zero substantive information to the grand jury. A few months later, during the build-up toward the trials, in March of 1970, Ruth Ann became pregnant. We do not know who the father of her child was. On September 5th, 1970, Barbara Hoyt flew to Hawaii with Ruth Ann Moorehouse, the family insinuating that her folks could be in jeopardy if she testified against Charlie. I was getting death threats, Hoyt recalled. Sometimes I knew who was calling. It was Squeaky or Sandy. The prosecution had to give my depositions to the defense, so they knew what I was going to say, and they knew it wasn't going to be good for Charlie. I stayed in touch with a few of them, trying to make them think I was still on their side. Using assumed names, the two girls flew to Honolulu, where they booked the penthouse suite of the Hilton Hawaiian Village Hotel. Barbara saw little of the islands, however, since Owish, sure the police would be looking for Barbara, insisted they remain in the suite. At approximately the same time each morning, Owish made a long-distance call. Just after the call on the 9th, Owish's manner suddenly changed. She became very serious and looked at me kind of strangely, Barbara said. Owish told Barbara that she had to go back to California, but that Barbara was to remain in Hawaii. She called and made a reservation on the 1:15 flight to Los Angeles that afternoon. They caught a cab to the airport, arriving just before noon. Owish said she wasn't hungry, but suggested that Barbara eat something. They went into a restaurant, and Barbara ordered a hamburger. When it arrived, Owish took it and went outside, telling Barbara to pay the check. There was a line at the cash register, and for several minutes, Barbara lost sight of Owish. When she came out, Owish gave her the hamburger, and Barbara ate it while they were waiting for Owish's flight. Just before she was to board, Owish remarked, "Imagine what it would be like if that hamburger had 10 tabs of acid in it." Barbara's response was, wow, she had never heard of anyone taking more than 1 tab of LSD. After Ruth Ann departed, Barbara then went into the city. All of a sudden, I was feeling really weird, very high, and I realized there were 10 tabs of acid in the hamburger. I got to a bathroom and I made myself throw up. I don't know how I did it, but I got to the steps of the Salvation Army building. A man asked me, "Are you all right?" I said no. I told him to call Mr. Bugliosi. They took me to a hospital and gave me Valium by IV to bring me down. That's when I lost consciousness. Even though they tried to kill me, I had to testify. I'd seen Sharon Tate's mother on TV talking about her grief. That's what swayed me. What it finally came down to for me was this. Did I want to be able to live with myself when I got old? I decided that I did. Barbara was flown home a few days later and became one of the most willing witnesses against the killers. The attempt to silence her actually turned her into a staunch opponent against the family for the rest of her life. By mid-November 1970, Ruth Ann was 9 months pregnant. She had evaded the authorities in California for poisoning Barbara Hoyt. Still, she was indicted, along with Squeaky, Gypsy, Clem, and Dennis Rice, on December 18th. Sentenced to 90 days in jail, Ruth Ann instead fled to Carson City, Nevada, where she delivered a baby daughter. Later, she married a construction worker and gave birth to another daughter. She divorced not long after. In 1975, Ruth Ann tearfully appeared before a judge in a Southern California courthouse, pleading for mercy on the charges she fled 5 years before. Wearing a bandage over her forehead, following plastic surgery to remove the X she had carved, she said she escaped in fear of the family, who wanted her to have her baby in prison. The judge agreed to set her free, satisfied that she had cut ties with the family, showing mercy due to her tender age at the time her own father introduced her to Charlie. She moved to the Midwest, married her third husband, and had 2 sons before divorcing in '94. Sadly, one of her daughters, her second child, died at just 7 years of age. We believe that Ruth Ann worked for many years in local media. Today, she is retired and a grandmother. Her father, Dean, died in 2005. In a conversation that I had 4 years ago with one of Ruth's sons, he informed me that his mother never spoke to her father after 1970. The stories of Ruth Ann Moorehouse, Dianne Lake, and Sherry Cooper reveal the stark realities of a cultural moment that blurred the lines between adolescence and adulthood. Their experiences within the Manson family underscore how societal shifts toward independence and rebellion can sometimes leave the youngest and most vulnerable unprotected. In their desire to be seen as mature and capable, these teenage girls were drawn into a world where their lack of experience made them easy targets for manipulation and harm. Charles Manson's ability to exploit their youth and insecurities serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers faced by those searching for belonging in all the wrong places. While these young women eventually escaped the shadow of Manson and the family and their crimes, their journeys were marked by trauma and struggle, consequences of decisions made before they had the tools to fully comprehend their implications. As we reflect on their lives, we are reminded of the importance of safeguarding young people, especially during times of cultural change. Adolescence is a time of exploration and growth, but without guidance and protection, it can also be a time of profound risk. The lessons from Sherry, Dianne, and Ruth Ann's stories are not just about the past. They are warnings for the future, urging us to ensure that independence and freedom do not come at the expense of safety and well-being. Through their lives, we see both the resilience of the human spirit and the high cost of misguided independence. Their stories call us to examine the ways we nurture and protect the young, ensuring that they can grow into adulthood with the wisdom and strength they need to thrive. California in the late 1960s held an almost mythical fascination for young people across the United States. It was the land of sunshine and opportunity, where dreams of freedom, creativity, and reinvention were said to bloom as vibrantly as its golden poppies. In the years between 1967 and 1969, California, particularly Los Angeles and San Francisco, became a beacon for seekers of all kinds: artists, musicians, hippies, and anyone disillusioned with the conventional path laid out by their parents. In this next video, we examine what California represented to the young people who ended up at Spawn Ranch, and how the Manson family became emblematic of the darker side of the California dream. Through the stories of 4 individuals, including Linda Kasabian, who would later play a pivotal role in the family's downfall, we explore how the golden promise of the West Coast was tarnished by disillusionment, exploitation, and violence.